This is Mr. Ed Millhouse. My name is Will Shoup. I'm the county arborist here in Prince William County. And so I'm going to let Mr. Millhouse introduce himself. He does not have a PowerPoint, so it's going to be some examples and then him talking. And of course, you'll have about 45 minutes to talk, and then we'll try to do some Q&A in the last 10 minutes or so. So, Mr. Millhouse, take it away.
Okay. It's Ed Millus.
Oh, no, sorry.
That's okay. You get used to answering anything after a while. We should have put an E on our name 100 years ago. It would have been a lot easier on everybody. This is a bait and switch situation. I was called last night and asked if I could fill in for Paige Thacker, who's under the weather. And she was in Blacksburg last week and came back with the flu. So there you go. If you don't want to go to Blacksburg.
I'm from Blacksburg.
You're from Blacksburg? Yeah. That's very interesting because I'm from Blacksburg too.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to say, you didn't bring in that flu up there.
Yeah.
I live up here, and even bring it, it's here. But I grew up in Blacksburg, and my dad was a professor at Virginia Tech for 33 years, and my mother was with Extension. And so I paid by honesty, I suppose. I got out of graduate school and took a job with the Extension Service in Prince William County. So I was in Paige Thacker's seat at that time and did that for 8 years. And in the meantime, married a Fairfax gal, so here I am, and always will be, I suppose. In 1985, I went into business, started a company running an IPM program, which we're going to talk about a little bit here, and did that for several years. In the late 80s, I started transitioning into doing more and more consulting and less contract work for various reasons, which we can talk about if you want. And so from 88 until now, I've been full-time consulting. Also with trees. Not so much with native plants. I'm interested in native plants. Trees is what I'm involved with mostly. And most of it is with developers. I tell them all, it's not so much in Prince William County, but in Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, Falls Church City. They require an arborist to be involved with development projects. So I tell everybody I'm a necessary pain in the ass for the announcement. Then we can talk about that some if you want. This is going to be free flow, obviously, since I'm pinch hitting. I'm going to talk about diagnostics. I understand the phase is going to be mostly discussing that, but I've got some information about IPM also. And rather than do questions at the end, I would say that if you have a question, just wave your hand and let's address it. I'd much rather have a conversation with you all and answer your questions than just sit up here and yammer away at you. Let me pass this around. This is about integrated pest management, and it's from a class that I taught at Virginia Tech for a while on that. I'm not going to do so much on IPM. As I say, if you've got questions, we can talk about them. But I'll be more focused on diagnostics, and that's what this one is. And I'll jump the gun a little bit. One of the things we're going to talk about is providing samples. Because if you are doing diagnostics in your own yard, that's one thing. If you're, how many master gardeners do you have? I actually helped with the first master gardener program in Virginia. So that was many years ago. We started that when I was an extension agent.
When was that?
Pardon me?
What year?
I would say 82, something like that, 81, 82. I don't know. We did it for 3 or 4 years, and then I left extension, but it had gotten started at that time. So what happened was I and 4 other extension agents, Francis Lay was in Arlington, Bruce White was in Alexandria, Liz Montgomery was in Washington DC, and Pam Marshall was in Washington DC. So the 5 of us put together a program and for the Master Gardeners and held it in Washington DC, Arlington, Alexandria, and Prince William County. We did that for several years, and I got to say it's the most significant thing I've ever been involved with. We had no idea what it was going to become at the time. We all hoped it. We actually questioned whether we would get an audience the second year or not. Would there be enough people interested? And lo and behold, there are probably tens of thousands of Master Gardeners at the beginning, so it's really taken off. As I say, I'm going to jump the gun and move ahead. One of the things that if you're dealing with samples like Master Gardeners do, then what is a good sample? And I've got 4 samples here that I brought along. Here are 2 that are fresh. And I'll pass these around and we'll talk about them a little later. But I often get stuck with things that are not fresh. Okay, this is something I collected out of curiosity, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then here's something I picked up at a dump at least 30 years ago. And even though this is nowhere near fresh, obviously, there are signs on this sample that tell you what might be the problem. And you all can see them from the back of the room. Can anybody guess what might be the problem? What might have been the problem with this poor plant? This is a juniper, a shrub, an upright shrub, as you can see.
The holes and the trails from an insect.
Well, I think those are things that occurred after it was dead. But there is something here very obvious, and nobody is going to get it.
No.
I'll pass it around. Y'all can check it out, and then we'll come back to it later.
Yeah.
What was that?
I said it seems like it has no bar.
No, it doesn't.
Is it the center?
Like I say, it came from a dump, a landscape dump. So when you're doing diagnostics, the first thing you got to know is what is the plant? I was joking. I went to the dermatologist the other day, and she was joking about going to parties, and people will say to her, "Well, could you look at this spot on mine?" And oh my gosh, what are we going to do here? The same thing happens to anybody in horticulture. You go to a party, and somebody said, "Well, I've got this plant. Could you maybe tell me what's going on?" Well, what is it? Oh, gee, I don't know what. Well, you can't go anywhere if you don't know what the plant is. If I know what the plant is, at least I can get a book out or go on the internet and look it up and see what might be issues with it. If I don't know what the plant is, that's the end of the line. I really can't do much of anything in most cases. What's the plant supposed to look like? That's an important thing. As an extension agent, there were just so many times when people brought me things that it's just, Roberta tells me I should write a book on it, but I always think about the guy who called me and said he had scale on his plant, and he didn't know what the plant was, and that he had been spraying it for several years, and he still had the scale. And I said, "Well, can you bring me a sample of it?" And he clips off a piece and brings it into me. It was Eleagnus, fragrant Eleagnus. And y'all know what that is. It's got on the stems, it's got little lenticels that are very prominent. And he thought those were scale insects. And he had been spraying it for 5 years, several times a year, and was just very disappointed that the lenticels didn't go away. Okay, so what's it supposed to look like?
What do we done with the sweet temp?
Pardon me?
What do we done with the sweet temp? Liquid amber.
What is health? Is this plant healthy? So health is a continuum. None of us is healthy. We're all disease. That's the norm. It may be innocuous, it may be things that are just irritating, athlete's foot or whatever, but everybody is diseased. So health is this continuum, and on one end is perfect health, and on the other end is death. And we are somewhere on that continuum, and we don't know where. Jay Stipes, professor of plant pathology at Tech, some of you all may remember him, used to tell a story about a friend of his went to the doctor, and the doctor looked him over and said, "You're a picture of health, go out and live a long life." He walked out the door and dropped dead of a heart attack. So he was a lot closer to the end, the dead end, than the perfect health end. And he just didn't know it, neither did the doctor. When I'm talking with people about plants, I want to know, what is it that's bothering you about this plant? You know, think about the guy with the lentils. I could tell him that's no big deal, nothing to worry about. But if I don't know what the problem is, I can find lots of problems. You can't bring me a green leaf right now this time of year that doesn't have something wrong with it. So I want to know what it is that concerns you. There's no point in creating anxiety among plant owners by pointing out all the issues that they have. How long have you had this plant? Oh, I just planted it this spring. That's a lot different than when it was growing in my yard when I bought the property 30 years ago. Completely different situations. What have you been doing to this plant? And I don't mean that like, what have you done to your plant? That's not the point. It's what have you been doing in the way of cultural practices for this plant? An overwhelming issue this past year would be what? Drought.
Yeah.
It didn't rain. So if you didn't water your plants, the chances are they didn't look too good. I think when I was learning diagnostics from at Virginia Tech and took a class called Plant Clinic, 2 terms, and it was the best class I ever had. We went out and looked at things with specialists every week, and when I went in there, I started off thinking, well, I'm going out this week for 3 hours with a wheat specialist. What do I care about wheat? It just doesn't have any charm for me, except when it's cooked and I'm eating it. But I learned immediately that I could learn things from him, even though he didn't care 2 hoots about trees. We went out in a wheat field. We walked out 300 feet into this wheat field, and he dug a hole and he pulls up the tree root. And he says, "This damn tree is stealing nutrients from my wheat." And I looked at it and thought, whoa, that tree has quite a root system, doesn't it? And who knows where that thing came from, but there was a forest 300 feet away. And some root had gotten all the way out of there. Not at all unusual. There's a tree down on the Virginia Tech campus. If you ever go down there, it's a sugar maple. And I can't remember what building it's in front of. I can't remember the names of them, but it's like 30 or 40 feet down from the corner of the building. And you can see its root. It's right on the surface. It grows right down along the sidewalk and then turns and goes around the corner of the building and goes on into that quadrant. All right. And that's, how did that root find its way down there? I don't know, but it's a long way from the base of that. The tree is only like that big. When you're thinking about diagnostics, obviously the goal is we want to do something to fix the problem. And you got to make decisions on when you act, when you take action, take steps to do whatever it is that needs to be done to help the plant. If you're growing a crop, it's the threat of loss of produce, of the yield in the crop. But it might be that you're worried about the tree or plant or whatever being predisposed to secondary problems. There's a concept in a guy named Mannion, who's a plant pathologist, of a spiral of decline. So your tree is going along like this, and something happens to it. It gets defoliated by gypsy moth. Well, it declines a little bit, okay? Once it declines, it starts to send out signals to other secondary organisms that may zero on in on it. Borers can pick out a diseased plant from half a mile in the sky. So it's on that trajectory going down, and something else gets it, and it goes down a little further, and it goes on down the spiral of decline as it just disappears. For most of the people that we deal with, it's probably more likely that it's the plant has reached a point where it's no longer attractive to them. And then they want to do something about it. They want to make it pretty again. Limitations on all this. Well, one of them is that you can't make it pretty again this year. All right. When something happens to a green leaf, that's on that green leaf for as long as that green leaf hangs on the plant. All right. It's we can't cure plants. So there's just a handful of diseases on plants that you can really cure. One of them is powdery mildew. When I was in graduate school, I was responsible for a greenhouse full of roses for a while, and they were constantly getting mildew. And how did we control the mildew on them? We went in 2 or 3 times a day and syringed the plants, just a light mist of water, so there was free water on the foliage. Mildew can't grow in free water, and that just shut it down completely. Okay, now you put your shoe in the closet and look at it 2 or 3 years later. Yeah, it's going to be, that's prime for mildew. That's exactly what it was. So you're sort of constantly saying better luck next year. There's also the Lazarus effect. People would bring me a dead plant. They still do this. I got a lady call me last week, wants me to come look at a dead tree. What can I do to make it green next spring? Well, I'll come look at it if you really want to pay me to do that, but I'm telling you, it's not going to look green next spring. It's just not going to happen. And then some plants just have trouble. The rose family is notorious. If you've got something in the rose family, it's got problems. All of them, it just seems like. And they are some of our most prominent plants in horticulture. So that's just, it goes with the territory when that happens. Information. The information we have is generally short in supply. It's a heck of a lot better than it was when I was in school. And when I was in school in plant clinic, we had a whole library, a wall, at least that big, covered with books. And each one of them dealt with something, but there were only 2 books in the whole library that dealt with horticulture. That was it. So we are a whole lot better off now than we were then. Some of the information is hard to understand or hard to interpret, especially when you're new at it. I tell people, if you're just getting into diagnostics, if you're a master gardener that's starting out, you learn it one plant at a time. Focus on something that you like in your yard and watch it closely all year, and you can see the problems come along. Find out what they are and learn about them at that time. It's like bagworms. And once you've told somebody about bagworms 20 or 30 times, you're kind of an expert on bagworms, and you'll never forget about it. Used to tell us to ask the plant owner lots of questions. Do you water it? Do you fertilize it? So forth and so on. How do you fertilize it? And then the caveat that went with that was, but don't believe a word they say. And it is rather comical. Some people are bashful and don't want to admit that they've done something to this tree or plant. Others just are absolutely clueless. They don't realize that by digging a sewer line 2 feet from a big tree, it might cause some damage. You just never know about it. So ask them lots of questions, but take it with a grain of salt. Let's go back to our sample here. Has anybody figured out what's wrong with this?
It's like the roots.
What are the roots problem? What led you to say that?
They seem to be short and stubby, and they weren't the regular root system.
Okay, they could have been rotted off or, this has been sitting in that dump for a long time, obviously. But that's a good place. You get a door prize. Anybody else?
I thought that was the top of the trouble.
You thought this was the top?
No, I thought that was the top of it. Where that had been cut off or rejected by a plant or something.
This was a nursery disposal site. So what happened was this plant died, they yanked it out and brought it home and threw it in the dump.
Was it wrapped in burlap and too tight?
It wasn't when I saw it, but who knows? Who knows? I mean, that's kind of standard in the industry, isn't it?
Right.
Anything else that anybody?
Spin holes in it.
The holes, I think, are secondary.
Okay.
Okay, actually, one of them's from a core sample. Yes.
The cracks seem to be like getting to the middle.
Again, I think that's secondary predominantly. Some of this, like this one, this is two stems that grew together. They started out, when they were this big, they were separated. And as they grew, they coalesced into a, on this side, there are two stems, but on this side, it's one stem.
There's somebody's egg cases on there was a patch that, sort of a white, there.
So that's some sort of fungus, and I would expect a fungus to be growing on something that's sitting in the dump for as long as this happened. You're not gonna get it, but but you'd be amazed how many times I've shown this to people. In fact, when I collected it, two arborists that were with me, Peter Deal, one of them, probably some of you all know Peter, immediately said that plant was in the ground too deep. All the roots are growing up. And when you look at the core sample of this plant, you took a cross-sectional cookie of it. This is a cookie. So if I took a cross-sectional cookie of it, you would see that this plant was loving life in the production nursery where it got fertilized and watered every couple of days and life was good. And then it was put in the real world and planted 6 inches too deep. And the growth rings went from that big to that big. Okay, that's not unusual for us in the tree business. I get samples and I look at a cross section of it and I'll say, I don't know what happened to this tree, but something happened in this year because it was growing great and then it just stopped growing. What could that have been? And then you can, I was in a court case years ago where we went back and looked at the record on, we could count the tree rings and we could see something happened to this tree 18 years before. And you start talking to everybody, they say, well, the neighborhood was developed 18 years ago. This is construction damage, is what we're looking at. So sometimes you can get that kind of information. One other thing that talking about limitations I want to mention is Hardin's Law. The ecologist out in California who's famous for various things, and some of them notoriously famous, but he has a law that says there's no single effect, the spider web effect. So you touch a spider web up here and it vibrates everywhere else. And that's true for plants. When you do things in your yard, it will affect other plants around that area. And the effect may be beneficial, it may be negative, it may be subtle, it may be very obvious, but when things are done, it changes everything around it too. Sometimes that's important. So tools of the trade, this is real simple. I carry a hand lens with me all the time. And this is a 5-power. This is plenty for most of what we're going to do. I have a compound microscope and I have a dissecting microscope, and I very rarely use it. Most of the time, that's not going to give me any better vision than what I can see with the hand. And then I carry a pocket knife all the time. Did anybody notice anything on this sample?
It's real.
They're a little
Turning brown.
Got yellow on the tips.
Got some yellow tips.
Brown.
The bottom of the lower leaves are spotted, but not the upper leaves.
You know,
Sure.
some like black leaves.
Little black spots.
That would tell me that the older foliage is affected by this, not so much the newer. The spots are a fungus, and I don't know which one. This is out of my yard. And I've been watching it for a couple of years, and what got my attention on it was that I went out in the spring. This is a yew that I planted this big out of the pot. I bought it as a dwarf conifer. I have no idea what it is. The tag is long gone, but I absolutely love it. It's about 7 feet tall now and about this wide. So it's a very dramatic upright pattern of growth. And in the spring, the foliage, the new foliage is just this absolutely stunning lime green. So all my neighbors love it. It's very dramatic. But it came down with this leaf spot on it. And I noticed it because I went out there in the spring and all the old needles were falling off of the ground. You could see a layer of old needles on the ground. I have my ideas about it. I could take this and take a sample of it, put it under the compound microscope, see the fungus. These are fruiting bodies. See the fruiting body and see what form of fruiting body was. I suspect it's what's called a pycnidium, which looks like a pimple that's erupting. And spores inside it, and you can count the cells in each spore. If it's got 2 spores or 2 cells in each spore, that tells you one thing. If there are 3, it's a different fungus. So you can do that with a compound microscope. But you know something? It doesn't matter. I'm not going to spray this. This is in my yard. It's on its own. My integrated pest management approach to stuff like this is that if this croaks, I will just get a different plant and put it in. And that is a perfectly good approach.
Speaking of fungi. I've got I want an acre and a half. Part of it is woods, and my red oaks are dying. Isn't that due to some fungus out there? And what am I?
That's a good question. Red oaks are dying, oaks are suffering all over. Red oaks, when I was in school, red oaks have been declining, and that has been documented in literature since before World War II.
Oh, really?
So there's been a long running problem with it, and nobody has put a finger on it just yet. When I was in graduate school, everybody's going, well, maybe it's air pollution. Okay. We had one of my colleagues was trying to use white pine as a bioindicator of air pollution damage. A guy named Ed Hayes, y'all may have run into him. He's a now retired forester from Minneapolis, did a lot of work with tree risk assessment. Ed thought that he could use white pine, monitor the spots on the white pine needles, and measure the ozone level in the air and correlate that data with the spots. And he got so he could measure the ozone level, and when it reached a certain point, he could find spots on the needles of white pine in 6 hours. And this was really astounding when that came out. It shook the world. Ed got on National Public Radio and PBS for this work using a plant as a bioindicator of air pollution. Quite so. The red oaks.
The red oaks are-
Yeah, the red oaks. So red oaks, we were all saying maybe it's air pollution. Well, then it's suddenly acid rain, maybe. Okay, but that could be. Who knows? I don't think we really do know what. Climate change is the current bugaboo. Maybe that is affecting them. Maybe it isn't.
Well, it's increased in deterioration of my oaks in the last 5-10 years.
I would say that my colleagues have been talking about oaks declining, particularly red oaks, for 20 years. And I heard, this is this is just an intriguing idea, who knows if it's really true, but I heard a forester say that perhaps red oaks don't really belong here in the numbers we have there. Perhaps they have moved in and replaced American chestnut. And they're not really geared up for this, what we are putting them, what they are growing in now. So they don't live to their potential, which, I think a typical red oak, you correct me if I'm wrong here, 250 years, 150 years.
Yeah, the red oaks are not quite as hardy as the white oak group. And so they do tend to get more root rot. They're a little more, they're not as good at compartmentalizing as the white oaks are, so and they seem to be more susceptible to bacterial leaf storage.
Bacterial BLS is a big problem, definitely. BLS bacteria, and, this is a fascinating story about BLS. I don't, Jim Sherrill, did you know Jim Sherrill? Jim Sherrill was a plant pathologist in Washington, D.C., and he discovered BLS. And he asked us arborists if we would keep an eye out for scorched foliage on trees and let him know if we saw it. At that time, it was such an unusual thing to see that if I saw an oak with scorched foliage in the fall, late summer, early fall is when it shows up, I would call all my buddies and say, guess what I saw? And they would jump in their cars and drive down to where this tree was so they could see it too. Now I can walk up the street and see it. It's everywhere. Okay, so what's going on? What happened? And if you keep up with it, BLS is the bacterium is forget the name at the moment, but it was actually identified in the 1800s as Pierce's disease of grapes and phony disease of peach. Those were the disease names. It's the same bacterium that causes all three problems. Well, in the 1800s, people really didn't give two hoots about red oaks. They were concerned about peaches and grapes, obviously. They were economically important, but trees were everywhere, so it was no big deal. But once we discovered what the bacterium was and realized that it had been seen in other places, then scientists began to find it everywhere. It's in weeds all over the place. It's in English ivy. It's in lots of shrubs. It's very, very common. And in most of those plants, it's asymptomatic. It doesn't cause any problem. But when it gets in oaks and red maples and lots of other things, then it causes them to decline. And again, I don't think we know why. But there are other things going on too. I mean, suburban life is hard on trees. That's all there is to it. But some of y'all may remember Ethel Dutke, who was the plant clinic manager at the University of Maryland. She retired maybe 15 years ago. We had a hurricane one year, and it didn't cause much damage. But Ethel, in the winter at the seminars, said to us, pay attention to your oak trees because you're going to find a lot of them have root rot this spring because this hurricane dislodged them slightly. Not enough for you to notice perhaps, but now all those roots are damaged. And lo and behold, we started seeing root rot that spring and then later on saw borers. And when we looked at the situation, I've got an oak in my yard, a pin oak that I watched after a hurricane a few years ago, and I could see cracks running up two sides of it where the wind had blown it and bent it. Okay, those cracks are not obvious, and today you would not even know they're there unless you had been aware of them beforehand. So a lot of those things linger and cause damage. And again, remember that spiral of decline. They start to have problems, the root rot moves in, the borers move in, and the next thing you know, it's dead.
That's our best guess for what's happened, especially in suburbia, because we had a big building boom in the 70s, and a lot of those trees got planted then, and now it's 50 years later, and you're getting to that stage in life where just like, and you're talking about arthritis and stuff. in people, Same thing happens to the trees, and that's part of that spiral that makes them susceptible to those secondary things. Like you said, the red oaks are not as good at compartmentalizing, so they get hit by root rot. Other things that get into them, they're going to be continue to be stressed. And that may be why all of a sudden the bacterial leaf scorch exploded, because air pollution, climate change, all those things are widespread environmental stressors, and then all of a sudden they can't control the bacteria. By the way, bacterial leaf scorch is really pretty easy to diagnose in the field, because it progresses slowly from the tips of from the edges of the leaves inside. So you've got the brown necrotic dead tissue. And then you have a band of the yellow stuff that is dying. And so the bacteria is in there probably digesting the chlorophyll first. So you get the yellow, and then you've got the green tissue. There are a lot of other things that can make it look scorched that are not bacterially scorched, but they do it more straightforward, so you don't get that band of yellow dying tissue.
The, going back to the diagnostic aspect of one of the issues for bacterial leaf scorch is that some oddity, scorched foliage often indicates a lack of water, and that can mislead you. But in a year such as this, when we have no rain, bacterial leaf scorch doesn't really express itself on trees. So it's very tricky when you have a dry year to find bacterial leaf scorch. It's counterintuitive. When it rains lots and lots and lots, it's real obvious. So,
Can I ask you about, I haven't had a problem with my red oak. It's my whites that are all dying.
Same.
Yeah, it's the same,
I mean,
it's the same
same.
process.
Again, okay.
The white oaks seem to,
But they go
white-
dramatic, like 1 year they're here, boom, they're gone.
yeah, that's because the year before they were nearly dead.
Yeah.
Back when we had, 18 months of above average precipitation, it was
Yes, I do.
2018.
Yes.
And then July 8th, we had a 10,000 year storm, and then it stopped raining.
Mhm.
right.
That summer, we had a lot of trees that just all of a sudden died.
Yeah.
Whole foliage looked healthy. I had one person call me and said, we went away on vacation. The tree looked perfect when we left. When we came home, all the leaves were dead. Part of that, I think, is what I call catastrophic hydraulic failure. In other words, all of those water tubes snapped, and all of a sudden it wasn't pumping water in the canopy. But out at Front Royal, at the Smithsonian Research Station, they had a bunch of black oaks that died. When they cut them down and did the equivalent of a tree autopsy on, they found those trees had been dying for 10 years.
Oh, this was the last straw.
So this was just the last straw, and that would go back to when I looked at that and started looking at weather data. We had a drought back in the 2012 to 15 years, and that probably set a lot of them up.
Sure.
And it's just taken a while for them finally to die through that spiral effect.
Yeah, I mean, we generally have poorly drained soils here, so when we get excessive rain, it may stay wet for a long time, and that's really hard on lots of trees. Another issue that's with the red and white oaks, but ambrosia beetle. When you see a lot of fine sawdust at the base of the tree, ambrosia beetle is a good possibility. And this is another oddity in that 20 years ago, we really didn't see much damage with ambrosia beetle, but in the last 5-10 years, it's been devastating.
And that's, again, they're one of those secondary
Absolutely, could
things
be.
that come in and they're attacking stressed trees.
This is ambrosia beetle is a good example of the difficulty we have. University of Maryland, Mike Raup up there monitors ambrosia beetle very closely. They use ethyl alcohol to attract it. So when they set a trap with ethyl alcohol, they monitor it. When they see an ambrosia beetle and record that date. Well, they've had ambrosia beetles in their traps from mid-February all the way up until August. With that long a time period, what do you do about it? The pesticides that we have available to us for protecting an oak only last 2 or 3 weeks. So what are you gonna do?
And the ambrosia beetles are hardwood.
What's that?
I said the ambrosia beetles bore into the hardwood and
Yeah, you can't get,
You
you
can't
gotta,
get anything
you have to
there.
protect the plant. Once it's
Right.
inside, you can't touch it, can't do anything to it.
yeah,
But
there are bigger, well, there is one ambrosia beetle they've been looking for. It's not native, it's a Japanese oak ambrosia beetle. Really terrified that those things are gonna get over here. It's still go after healthy trees too. But it's,
You know, a lot of people say there are no healthy trees in Northern Virginia anymore.
well, the healthier trees.
But you had a question back there.
Well, I was just wondering if, could you talk a little bit about pruning and what that does to a tree?
A little bit, although we could spend a couple of days talking about that. One other thing about the ambrosia beetle, and again, going back to the diagnostics. This past year, I went out in my yard. I've lived in my house since 1983. And I have there's a persimmon in my yard, which was yay big when we moved in. And I go out in my yard last spring and there's sawdust all over the bottom 2 feet of this tree. And I thought, oh dear, ambrosia beetle. Well, I didn't mess around with them. There's nothing to do. And I just went on about my business. But a few months later, I said, I ought to go take a look at that tree. I was thinking maybe I could do something with this wood, actually. But I went out and I looked at it, and ambrosia beetle is a tiny little beetle. So the holes are pin size. Okay? That's not what I saw on this tree once the sawdust was gone. They were capital D-shaped holes. So what does that tell you?
I know what it tells me.
But you're too well trained.
There's a bug that creeps up specific.
Okay, you have borers. Borers run into the tree or exit. This is an exit hole. When you see a D-shaped hole, you know it's a flathead borer as opposed to a roundhead hole. If it's a round hole, it's a roundhead hole. Well, immediately that cuts down on what you need to look at to figure out what's going on. Okay, here's a flathead borer hole in my persimmon. Immediately I go in and start looking in the literature. There's only one flathead borer listed on persimmon, and it's the painted persimmon borer. Okay, this is a clearly moth. It looks like a wasp or something of that sort, a hymenoptera. And it's attracted, it's exclusively feeds on persimmons. I've never seen it before, still haven't seen the insect, I'm assuming that's what it is. Okay. Pruning, is pruning a healthcare practice? Can be. This is not shaking no.
Black knot,
Might not.
black knot
Black,
on cherries.
black knot, you can prune out black knot on cherry, yes. Although I was taught that when you have black knot on cherry, that tells you that the plant is not growing well. It's going to come back. But pruning, if you prune, you are causing damage to the plant. You cannot cut off green tissue and not cause damage. So that's the first thing you have to accept is that you are going to cause damage to the plant. Pruning may be justified, it's overdone. Topping is pruning, but it's not considered an acceptable practice. The new topping is skinning out the tree, just going in and cutting all the branches off for 8 or 10 or 15 feet out of a branch. That is very detrimental to the tree.
That's called lion tail.
Lion tailing is what in California, they skin the branch out and then they cut the tip off and get a poodle for a lion tail.
Ah,
So that's what they call it. I learned it as skinning out. You go in and you just skin everything on the inside. And it tells you the person climbing the tree was scared to go out on a branch, so he just got everything he could reach and didn't go any farther. But I've worked with people who thought it was a good idea. I worked with a very famous park, and they had a signature tree in the front yard, southern red oak, that was perfect open row shade, beautiful tree. It was on their stationery, and they skinned it out. And I'm going, you really shouldn't do that. And I'm going, well, we like the way it looks. Okay, that spring we had a late frost. The tree leafed out in April. We had a frost in early May. It killed every leaf on that tree, and it did not grow a leaf back. It was dead. And I lay that on the pruning that's done. When you skin out the tree, one in the shade is 10 degrees cooler, isn't it? So all those internal leaves are 10 degrees cooler than the outer foliage. When it gets to be 95 degrees, that outer foliage just shuts down and stops photosynthesizing. But that inner foliage keeps on going. I have a friend who refers to it as starvation on the installment plan. The other thing that it does is we know from research that when you skin out a tree, you make it more likely to fail structurally than if you don't skin it out. So we know this is not a good practice, but we keep doing it.
What about thinning?
So is thinning a good idea? That's a good question. I have a problem. I think it's very arrogant for me or any arborist to walk into somebody's yard, look at a tree for 10 minutes I have never seen before that's been growing for 75 years and say, you really ought to do this and this and this to make that tree safer. Nonsense. That tree it's doing what it knows how to do. Now, that being said, there are situations where thinning out a tree may be useful. Definitely if it's a fruit tree, you got to do that, but that's a very artificial situation. I grew up in, if you're familiar with Blacksburg and Virginia Tech, there's a Stadium Woods is an old growth forest, the only university in the country that has an old growth forest on their campus. I lived and played in Stadium Woods. My house down there where I grew up had 13 trees, and they were 60-some inches in diameter. The biggest one was 66 inches in diameter, white oak. Okay, so that tree is 500 years old. We owned that property from 1955 till 2023. We pruned that tree 3 times in that whole time period. Okay, so that anybody who tells you, well, I've got to prune my tree every year, there is something wrong. Okay, that just does not compute in my book.
There are people who have that mindset that trees have to be pruned.
Well, I mean,
And when you tell them they don't. They just
lots of commercial arborists have that mindset, So,
We do fruit trees, because I've had a lot of fruit trees. You want fruit,
you got to prune
you
that.
have to prune.
Yeah, that's not arboriculture.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
that's not really
that is a production product or a production method for producing that fruit. And yeah, you got to do it if you want to have good fruit. But typically, we're not growing oaks for that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
That's talking about pruning. Like, what about pruning like water spouts or the water sprouts?
So what I was taught was that if a tree grew a green leaf, it meant for it to be there.
Yep.
You cannot make a plant healthier by cutting green tissue off. By definition, you reduce its ability to photosynthesize. So if it's got water sprouts, if it's been skinned out, it's going to have water sprouts, suckers. They're going to be everywhere, all over. But it often indicates that something has happened to that tree.
Yeah, it's an evolutionary response to stress.
Yeah, you might want to step back. And I looked at this with a lady recently. She has a sycamore that the utility industry cuts all the time. Okay, and I'm going to stand up for them. They don't have any choice. They have to do that. But this sycamore has been pruned repeatedly, and every year at the base or within 10 feet of the base, it sends up these sprouts. And she wants to cut them off. And I'm going, that tree is trying to cover itself up. It does not like to be hit by the sun the way it is. So that's a defense mechanism for the tree. And she made the comment to him, we cut them off every year and they keep growing back. I'm going, well, maybe you shouldn't cut them off. For heaven's sake, you know? Kind of telling you something. We're gonna run out of time, and I want to
So we can.
show you this. This tree is from Fairfax County. And it's a hickory. And it's 330 years old.
Whoa, I lived in some hard times.
This tree was on Pleasant Valley Road, which you're familiar with. It was,
It's a hard place to be a tree.
what's that?
I said, that's a hard place to be a tree.
You know, you think about this tree, virtually every tree in Northern Virginia was cut in 1863 when it's so cold in the Civil War. They were stripping buildings to get firewood. Why was this tree left? The whole forest around it was just like this. And you look at a stump of a white oak that was, you know, this big, and it would be 350, 400 years old. It's like, whoa, what is going on here? I collected this one because it was a 2-lead hickory. One leader was upright, and the other one came up about this high, and then bent over, grew at a like a 45, 50 degree angle that way. What happened to this tree? This is what we call a shear plane fracture. So if I'm, think about a tree limb or a trunk of a tree as a big lever, and it gets bent, and it bends and it bends and it's wind, ice, whatever. And at some point, it separates longitudinally. Okay, that's a shear plane fracture. That's what this is. You can see it right there. And it happened when the tree was this big. At that point, this tree was about 50 years old when it was that big. And then it had this catastrophic damage done to it, and yet it lived another 250 years, for heaven's sakes. Okay, it was in terrible condition, but it was still alive. And they were going to develop it, and I asked the developer if I could have a sample. He said, take any of them that you want. So I cut it down and brought it home. I had no idea what it was going to look like when I cut it, but that is really phenomenal when you think about it. So another thing about diagnostics is that, especially with woody plants, well, maybe there's nothing you can do, but maybe there's nothing you should do. Maybe you just let it go on and do its thing. That's okay. I had in the derecho, remember the derecho?
Yeah.
Okay, so the derecho came through. I had 16 trees go down in my yard. One of them was an American linden. There were 2 American lindens. They were about yay big. They were growing maybe as hard as one of these tables. And they had volunteered, and I just let them grow. And they came down. Well, they're lying on their side. And I said, you know, what the heck? I cut the end off one so I could get the lawnmower. And I just left them there. Now I have this one mass of stems of an American linden. It's about 40 feet tall now. And you look around at American lindens, and that's not an unusual growth pattern to find. Multi-stems, and they seem to do just fine that way. So I'm letting it grow, and most of, several people knock on my door all the time saying, "Do you want us to cut down that dead tree?" No, I like that dead tree.
A healthy hickory tree about that size, what age would you expect it to be?
So it's, this is one of the things about people say all the time, well, how old is that tree? And I was taught only a fool guesses the age of a tree. If it's in good growing conditions, a 13-inch hickory is, I would say 40 years old typically. It's a slow growing tree, but it could be more like that. I've got a little sample. This is a good story, but I worked for a developer out in Clark County years ago. And the situation was he had bought 40 acres from a landowner there. The landowner, the property was in an original land grant from the King of England. So it had been in the family for hundreds of years. The deal was that the landowner could come in and take 2 trees off of the site that he wanted, and then the developer do whatever he wanted. This developer was going, you know, these trees are really nice, I'd like to keep them, but the county had zoned the property, laid it out into 40 1-acre lots. And it was, every tree was gonna go. So he asked me, is there any way we could save these trees? We went in, and for a year, we met with the local government, begging them to let him do cluster development, put 40 houses in the back area and save these trees. Okay? In the meantime, the neighbor came in, the landowner came in and cut down a white oak. I went out there and there was this little piece, this little triangle attached to the stump. I broke it off and stuck it in my pocket and took it home. Later on, when I sanded it down and counted the rings, it was 11 inches. There was 204 growth rings in 11 inches. So when this tree was 22 inches in diameter, it was 204 years old. But this tree was 6 feet in diameter. How old was that tree? It was 600 plus years old. Okay? So you just never know when you see a tree of how old is it actually is.
Yeah, I don't wanna cut it down, find out.
Yeah.
You can't take a core sample of it, but that's a whole other thing. Yes,
What effects on trees can we expect from the spotted lanternfly, which is just exploding?
what can we expect from our trees? That's a good question. You know, I've got spotted lanternfly. This will be my 4th year with it. I'm 100 yards from the railroad, and that's where they came from. And that's where they move around. So I found them in my yard 3 years ago. And now this past year, there were thousands of them. They have not touched my trees. They love grapevines. So they're all over the wild grapes that are growing up and plaguing everybody in the
And
neighborhood.
tree of heaven.
Tree of heaven is their host, and I don't have any tree of heaven, but
And they seem to be covering my maples.
I've seen them on red maples very heavily. I understand they like walnut, but they have not touched my black walnuts. You know, this is one of those things that I don't think we really know what's going to happen. There is good news in that birds have started to find them. In the first year, the birds wouldn't have anything to do with them. This past year, I found carcasses of spotted lanternflies all over the place where the birds heading. There's also a fungus in Pennsylvania that is knocking the population down. So, you know, there is some hope, but it's going to be a number of years of misery.
Yeah, at this point, if you would talk to a forestry department, they would tell you they're not as concerned about it, because it doesn't seem to be a real issue for forests or non-fruit trees. But they are continue to be a pest for the fruit production. The apple trees, the stone fruits, the grapes, things like that, because they're affecting the size of the fruits.
There's you know, this is like so many of our issues. It's as much a person problem as it is for plants. If spotted lanternfly secretes this gooey exudate, it falls down and grows sooty mold. And people up in Philadelphia tell me that you can't even go into the backyard; everything is just black from sooty mold. So they can't use their patios at all. That's in the category of a people problem more so than a plant problem. The trees are doing okay. Actually, their trees are tree of heaven, so it's kind of like, what do you expect? But that's a fairly common thing. Definitely. I meant to say, as far as native plants goes, one of the great things about native plants is that they tend to have few problems. The problems that many of our plants have are the result of some exotic pest being brought in, emerald ash borer, that just runs amok. So that's a kind of an isolated situation. But most of our native plants, I think about it in my yard, I've got a patch of Solomon seal, can't think of the names. One of the plant people can tell me what Solomon seal genus is. But I had this patch of Solomon seal, been there for 25, 30 years, and getting bigger and bigger, and I love it, and the birds love it. And I went out there one day, 5, 6 years ago, have to walk by it to get to the shed. And I walked by and I thought, gosh, something's eating my Solomon seal. And I checked it out, and it was a sawfly. And if you don't know sawflies are akin to wasps and bees, and they're gregarious. They feed in clusters and groups. So these sawflies had gotten my Solomon seal, and they ate every single leaf off of it in a matter of a week. But it happened at the end of the season. The plants had already flowered, the fruit was mature. Now I had all these bare stems, not a leaf on them, with a cluster of fruit on the end. And I thought, wow, isn't this fantastic? The sawfly did okay out of this deal. The Solomon seal never even knew anything happened. What's not to love? And I'll tell you, we're gonna run out of time here, but
Go ahead.
one more story, going back to diagnostics, there's another gregarious insect called the orange striped oak shows up in late summer, early fall, and it eats the lower branches of particularly pinup. It just loves pinup. And people freak out. It's right at eye level and they can't miss it. And all of a sudden, there are these thousands of caterpillars all over this branch and they're defoliated. And they just go crazy about it. It's no big deal. It doesn't really do anything. But in Tidewater, Virginia, this insect, orange striped oakworm, defoliates the whole tree. Why? We don't know. But in Tidewater, Virginia, it's a major problem.
Maybe the zone that it's in.
I don't know.
Does it get there
Peter
earlier?
Schultz.
Does it get there earlier?
No.
Has more time to eat?
Peter Schultz, who is an entomologist at Virginia Tech, was transferred down to Virginia Beach to the experiment station. And everybody said, well, what are we going to do about orange striped oakworm? He says, don't worry about it. They don't do any damage. They just eat the lower branches. Well, lo and behold, he didn't realize that in Tidewater, they ate the whole tree. Okay. About 10 years ago, the same thing happened in Northern Virginia. 1 year. And there was an elderly arborist, Jim Biller, Foreman Biller, had been in the tree business since he was a 10-year-old kid, and he was in his 80s. And I asked Jim, have you ever seen this happen? Never. Never before. They ate the whole tree 1 year, and the next year they went back to normal practices and just eat a branch at a time. So, ain't nature wonderful? All right, I'm going to leave. I gave one door prize away, but I've got some other books here that y'all can take if you want. And holler if you have a question. We're out of time for this.
Thank you.